You know, I had my first real experience of prayer and fasting when I was in middle school. I was going to a church, and there was a kid at that church whose name was Jacob. And Jacob was a few years younger than me, but I went to youth group with two of his older siblings. And Jacob was sick. He wasn't even 10 years old, and he was looking death in the face. And so we prayed for him. The whole church prayed for him that God would heal Jacob. In fact, the youth pastor even organized a day when all of the students would come and we would fast and we would pray for 24 hours that God would heal Jacob. And so for 24 hours, we prayed every hour on the hour as we slept in the church auditorium on chairs that we pushed together that God would heal Jacob. And as we prayed, we reminded ourselves that Jesus said things like, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you will receive it and it will be yours. And he said things like, ask and you will receive that your joy might be full. And he said things like, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. And I heard those words of Jesus and I really, truly believed them. And so for the first time in my life, I fasted. And as a middle schooler, if you've met a middle schooler, they're quite hungry all the time. And so it was a real challenge to fast for 24 hours, to eat no food, to drink nothing but water, and for every hour on the hour to pray with my friends that God would save Jacob's life and that God would heal Jacob. A couple months later, Jacob died. And I prayed differently after that. And I don't know if I've ever prayed the same since with such a true sincerity and belief that God would answer. And maybe you're like me. You believe in the power of prayer. You believe in the God who sees. You believe that God answers prayer. Deep in your soul, you believe that God hears and answers our prayers. But what you also know is that God doesn't always answer our prayers, at least not in the way that we were hoping against hope that he would. Sometimes we pray and God says no. Sometimes you pray for something good and right and pure and God says no. And it's a hard no. Like you prayed for God to save your marriage and now you're divorced. Or you prayed that God would provide financially and you got evicted or foreclosed on. You asked God for healing and you witnessed only disease and death. You asked and you did not receive. You sought and you did not find. You knocked and it was like nobody answered. And it's not even that you have this like transactional relationship with Jesus where you think of him as this giant genie in the sky. Like you have a real relationship with Jesus, but in any relationship, there are times when you really hope that the other person comes through, and there are times in your life where you prayed and you asked and you sought and you knocked, and you feel like Jesus really didn't come through. What do you do with that? Is there something bigger at play that we're not understanding? If so, what is it? What's the answer? What is even the question? I don't want to leave you in suspense this morning, so I'm going to tell you up front. I have no idea. And I know that's not very comforting, but I hope that we can learn to wrestle through the questions well together. And when I say wrestle, I mean that almost literally. In the Old Testament, there was a man named Jacob who was facing an uncertain future. And on the eve of a potential conflict, there was this mysterious figure that emerged and began to strive with him and grapple with him and wrestle with him. And in the night, in this wildly confusing encounter, Jacob is wrestling with this figure who he perceives as some physical representation or physical manifestation of God himself. And so while he's in the midst of this struggle, what he does is that as he is facing uncertainty and confusion, he refuses to let go until God blesses him. Though he is weary, though he is injured, though this whole encounter is wildly confusing, he refuses to let go in the midst of the uncertainty until God blesses him. May the same be said of us. You know, as we've been looking ahead to Easter, we've been journeying through this series that we're calling Behold. And we've been exploring the spiritual disciplines of fasting and prayer. And spiritual disciplines, they can be described as uncomfortable practices that open windows to God's grace. And they're uncomfortable in that they require a certain amount of effort on our part. But maybe even the more uncomfortable part of these practices is that while they open windows to God's grace, while we're doing them, what we experience and feel sometimes is an absence of God's grace or an absence of God's presence. And that can be extremely disconcerting. So what do we do with that? What do we do when we prayed that God would avert disaster and disaster came nonetheless? What do we do when we pray and God gives a very clear and decisive no? Again, I don't have all the answers or frankly any answers, but I think we can have some frameworks that help us struggle through that, help us wrestle through that, help us strive through that in a way that maybe doesn't make it easier, but gives us hope in the midst of the struggle. So I want to give you 3 encouragements this morning for when God says no. And the first one is this: when you pray and God says no, turn to wonder. This is something that we say at Portrait a lot. One of our values is wonder over cynicism. We say often that we are seeking to turn to wonder. When God says no, he is inviting you to turn to wonder. I want to tell you a story that maybe is not going to feel like it's going to connect at first, but hang with me, it will in the end. Because the question that we're addressing here is really not a new question. In fact, the oldest piece of literature that we have in the entire Bible addresses this very question. And it's a story of a man named Job who lived in a land called Uz. And Job is described as a blameless and upright man who feared God. He was also a very successful man and a father of 10 children. And he was a pillar of his community. He was seeking after God not only for himself, but for all of his children, all the people around. He was a just and good and righteous man. But then we're introduced to this character who's referred to as the Satan. And that's a Hebrew word that means the adversary or the accuser. And the Satan goes before God in his holy court. And he says, you know, you're pretty high on this guy Job, but I bet you that the only reason he blesses you is because you have first blessed him. If you take away all his blessings, if you let me take away all the good things that you have put in his life, I bet you in a second, Job will curse you. And God said, behold, Job is in your hands. And so in one day, Satan kills all of Job's children. He takes all of Job's wealth. In one fell swoop, he ruins Job's entire life and leaves him desolate. And yet Job does not curse God. And so the Satan, he goes back to God and says, okay, that didn't work. But there's one last thing. If I take his physical health, that'll be the final straw. And finally, I'll have taken everything and he will curse you. And God says, behold, Job is in your hand. And so Satan strikes Job with painful sores and boils from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. So now here is Job, bereft, grieving, impoverished, and now physically ill. And yet Job does not curse God. Almost to the point where everybody else in his life is confused about it. Even his own wife says, Job, why are you still holding on? I think it's time that you curse God and die. Are there people in the room who are thankful that they have more encouraging spouses in times of trouble? But Job says, shall we receive good from God and not evil? Which is an interesting thing to say. But nevertheless, Job he's in a bad way, obviously. And so 3 of his friends, they come and they sit with him. And they sit with Job in his grief and in his desolation, and they sit in silence for 7 days with Job. Turns out that's the best thing that they possibly could have done, because once they start talking, things go downhill even worse from there. Because Job's friends, they're operating on a few different assumptions. They're operating on the assumption that God is just, which is a pretty good assumption, but they're also operating on the assumption that justice means that God always rewards the righteous and he punishes the wicked. So if God is just, and justice means that always rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked, and God has obviously afflicted Job, then that must mean that Job has done something wicked. 1 + 1 = 2, right? So when you read through Job for pages and pages and pages, Job and his friends are going back and forth, and they're like, Job, you just got to repent. And Job's like, for what? And they're like, well, you must have done something. Look at you. Look at your life. If you didn't do something wicked, why does your life look like this? And he says, I swear I haven't done anything wicked, and God will vindicate me. And they go back and forth and back and forth. And as it goes on, Job becomes more and more indignant with his friends. He says, like, you guys are not very good friends. These character assassinations, I've done nothing wrong. I don't deserve this. And as he goes on, he says, you know what? Not only do I not deserve all the affliction and the evil that's happened to me, you know what I do deserve? And he starts turning towards God and he says, what I do deserve from you, God, is an answer about why you did this. Why is it that you would take literally everything away from me when all I have done my entire life is try to serve you, is to try to do the right thing? Why would you let such evil befall me? And as the reader, you agree. You said, yeah, I would like an answer on this as well. Why would God let such an evil thing happen to such a good man? Finally, towards the end of the book, God himself answers. And I'll read to you in part what he says. This is in Job 38, beginning in verse 2. God answers Job and he says, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man, and I will question you, and you will make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garments and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. I won't read the whole thing, but this goes on for about 3 chapters. TLDR, God never answers the question. He only questions the questioner. He says, Job, remind me, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I separated the sky from the land? Where were you when I set the stars in place? Where were you when I filled the ocean with sea beasts that you can't even imagine? Where were you when I filled the earth with all manner of life? Where were you when I was literally holding the universe together before you were even born? He questions Job and says, where were you? Who are you in relation to the greatness and the splendor and the awesomeness and the bigness of Creator God? Where were you? And who are you to know and to question what it is that I do? And after this goes on for a while, it's finally Job's turn to talk. And when it's Job's turn to talk, he turns to God and he says, my bad. That's a paraphrase, but if you read it, that's pretty much the gist. Job is invited to turn to wonder. God never gives him an answer. At the end of the story, God blesses Job more than he was blessed even before. He blesses him with 10 more children and wealth that was beyond what he had. And he lives to be the age of 140. And the story just ends. Job never gets an answer. More to the point, I never get an answer. We are just invited to right-size our understanding of our place in God's big universe. We are invited to turn to wonder. So when you pray and God says no, you are invited to turn to wonder. You know, when I was a kid, there was an illusionist that came to my elementary school. And it was so fun to see him do all these tricks with cards and rings and all kinds of stuff. And afterwards, I remember talking to my friends, and we were standing around in a circle, and we're all trying to figure out, like, some of these tricks we'd never seen before. And we're trying to figure out, like, how this dude pulled off all of these tricks. And as you might imagine, the theories offered by a bunch of 9-year-olds weren't incredibly sophisticated. And in those days, we didn't have smartphones, dinosaurs roamed the earth, YouTube wasn't really a thing. And so if you didn't know something, like you just didn't know it. And we were like, I guess we'll never know. Let's go play on the monkey bars. And that was the end of that. Man, but we were drawn into wonder because not knowing was kind of half the fun. That we had seen these things before our eyes that we didn't quite understand. We knew there was something bigger at play, couldn't figure it out, had no resources to figure it out. But that was part of the fun. As a kid, it's so easy to turn to wonder. As an adult, it's easy to turn to wonder. When you see all the good things that God has orchestrated in your life, all the good and beautiful things that God has worked in his sovereignty in your life, it's easy to turn to wonder after the birth of your first child. It's easy to turn to wonder when you've achieved a dream. It's easy to turn to wonder when you've had some type of profound spiritual experience, this experience of God that maybe you've had for the very first time. It's easy to turn to wonder when you have the comfort of God's felt grace. I struggle to turn to that same kind of wonder when God's grace looks like I'm struggling or I'm suffering, and I don't know why, and I don't even know if there is a why. When God's grace feels a lot like his absence rather than his presence, it's a lot harder to turn to wonder in those moments. But that's exactly what we're being invited into. When you pray and God says no, you're being called to turn to wonder. Now, if you go home and you read Job this week, which I recommend it, if you're anything like me, you'll probably have a couple thoughts. And your first thought will probably be, oh my goodness, this is a lot of poetry. Like 40 chapters worth of poetry. And I'm pretty sure like a lot of it like went straight over my head. If you're like me, that's your first thought. If you're like me, and maybe you probably will have better, more holy thoughts than I have when I'm reading the Bible. But if you're like me, your second thought will be, I don't know if I like that story. I came to the Bible looking for comfort, and there wasn't a lot of comfort to be had in that book, at least on the surface. Like, you're telling me, like, this was a good dude, and God lets this guy's whole life get wrecked, like, in one fell swoop, just horrible, traumatic things. He lived to be 140. You think he forgot about the children that he lost? You think you would ever forget about children that you lost? And God lets all of these horrible things happen to this guy, and then when the guy questions it, God's like, don't worry about it, and then the book ends. So you're telling me, I read 40 chapters of poetry that I barely understand, the dude's life gets wrecked, he gets no answers, and at the end of the story, we don't know why. What I'm telling you is that sometimes the story ends and you don't know the why. But what God is inviting you into is an experience of the reality that his grace is real, even when his grace is not felt. When you pray and God says no, train yourself to turn to wonder. Practice turning to wonder. You know, that isn't to say that there are never any answers to be had, though, even if there are only ever partial answers. So when we pray and God says no, we can turn to wonder. But what else we can do is that we can also look for evidence of God's redemptive work in our life. Let me tell you another story. This one's about a young man named Joseph. Now, Joseph was one of 12 brothers, and all the boy moms in the room are thinking, I thought my hallway bathroom was disgusting. But he has 11 brothers. He was like the second to the youngest, and he's the favorite by like more than a little bit. And his dad was not ashamed of it. He was not afraid to show it. Coat of many colors. You've seen the musical, the whole thing. And what made it worse is that like he was having all these dreams. Like his brothers already kind of hated him and resented him because he was the favorite. But then he has like all these prophetic dreams, like dreams where God put visions directly into his head. And so he goes to his brothers. He said, listen to these dreams that God has given me. And the first one is him and his brothers, they're in the field and they're binding sheaves of grain. And all the sheaves that his brothers have bound, they start bowing down to his sheaf of grain. And then he says, I had this other dream where the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were all bowing down before me. And his brothers look at him and they're like, I'm sorry, what? Pipsqueak, you think we're going to bow down? That's what the conception you have of yourself, that we're all going to bow down to you and your coat of many colors? They couldn't stand this guy. They hated him so bad that they planned to kill him. But they thought better of it and thought they could at least get a few shekels. and they sold him into slavery instead. His own flesh and blood sold him into slavery, and he's carted away hundreds of miles away to Egypt. And once he gets to Egypt, he's sold to a high-ranking Egyptian official named Potiphar. And while he's enslaved, we get to see that Joseph he's a faithful and he's a talented guy. And so as he's serving in Potiphar's house, he starts rising through the ranks of all the roles within that household until he becomes the manager of the entire household. So through his faithfulness and through his skill, even though he's gone from being free to being hated to being enslaved, there's a measure of thriving going on there. That is until Potiphar's wife tries to sexually assault him. And he gets away, but then she accuses him of trying to sexually assault her. And so he's thrown in prison. So he goes from growing up with his brothers to being hated, to being enslaved, to being imprisoned. And so he's in this pit of a prison, but he's a faithful and talented guy. And so he starts earning the respect of the prisoners and even the prison guards. And he rises to a level of influence even in that space. And he begins interpreting even the dreams of his other prisoners that was a gift that God had given him, and he's using it even in this pit of a prison. And one of the dreams that he interprets was that of the former cupbearer to Pharaoh. And he interprets this dream, and the interpretation of the dream is that you're not going to be in this prison forever. You're going to go back into the court of Pharaoh. And when this dream comes to pass, and this cupbearer is being released, Joseph, he turns to the cupbearer, he says, "Remember me when you go to Pharaoh's court. Remember me. Don't forget me when you're back in Pharaoh's presence." And the cupbearer says, "Bet," and immediately forgets about him. And so, for all of his faithfulness, for all of his good works, for all of his service to others, Joseph is left to rot in this pit. That is until finally, the cupbearer remembers him. And it's when Pharaoh is having dreams that he can't interpret, and all of his wise men can't interpret the dreams for him. And the cupbearer is like, "Oh, I know a dude. He's in a pit. Let's see if he's still there." And obviously he's still there. So they bring him into the court of Pharaoh, and he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. And the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams is that there's going to be 7 years of agricultural abundance in the land, followed by 7 years of drought. And so if Pharaoh is smart, what you're going to do is you're going to gather all of the excess and the abundant years so that when the years of drought come, you will be able to feed all of your people. You'll be able to give food away. You'll be able to sell food, will actually increase the splendor of your empire. And the Pharaoh says, "Great, I'll put you in charge." And when Pharaoh says in charge, he means generally speaking of everything. So Joseph goes in a span of 13 years of mostly pain and suffering, from being hated to being enslaved to being imprisoned to being second in command in one of the largest empires in the world at that time. Eventually, his prophetic dreams come to pass from when he was a kid. And his brothers come to Egypt, and they bow down before him as they are seeking food to save their lives. And Joseph saves not only the lives of his family, but the lives of myriad families in and around Egypt. Eventually, his whole family comes and lives in Egypt with him. And eventually, his father dies. And after his father dies, his brothers are concerned. They said, "Joseph probably didn't do anything to us for the sake of our father while he was alive. But now that he's gone, there's nothing stopping him from doing whatever he's going to do to us for what we did to him all those years ago." And so they're concerned, and they're conspiring. They're trying to figure out, how can we get ahead of this? And Joseph kind of perceives that that's what they're doing, and so he stops them. And this is what he says to them in Genesis 50. "But Joseph said to them, 'Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones.' And thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. When you pray and God says no, turn to wonder, but also look for the evidence of God's redemptive work. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good. The devil meant it for evil, but God intended it for good. Listen, we live in a dark and evil world full of people who make dark and evil decisions. And what's more is that even apart from anybody deciding anything, dark and evil things just tend to happen anyway. The world is fundamentally broken, and God's not the one who broke it. That was us, humanity, and our sinfulness. But here's the amazing thing about God is that even though he is not the author of evil, he can use even the darkest, the most evil, the most twisted things and turn them for good purposes. And he does it basically all the time. So if you have prayed for something good and pure and right and God has remained silent, turn to wonder, but then also be on the look for evidence of his redemptive work in your life. He can turn even the most evil thing for good purposes. So go looking for it. Go searching for it. Turn to wonder, but also look for evidence that he is working in redemptive ways in your life. And sometimes it's hard to know what chapter of the book you're in. Like sometimes it takes years or even decades to gain that amount of perspective. And so sometimes you're too close to it. Sometimes you're like, yeah, I see the thing. I don't see the redemption in that. I don't even see how there could be, any possibility of redemption of this thing in my life. And you'll have to keep living to see and keep searching for the redemption that God wants to bring to that. And so if that's you, if you're too close, you can't see it. Let me refer you back to the first point. We can turn to wonder. But never stop looking for the redemptive work that God is surely doing in your life and in this world. All of this is very perspective shifting. But even if you do that, even if through confusion and pain you turn to wonder, you're looking for redemption, if you've ever done that, you know that it doesn't always make you feel better. So my third encouragement to you is this. When God says no, don't pretend that it doesn't hurt. You can turn to wonder, you can look for the redemption, but at the end of the day, you also don't have to pretend that it doesn't hurt. There are 150 Psalms in the Bible. It's the biggest book in the middle of your Bible. About 1/3 of those Psalms are lament Psalms. And what a lament psalm is, it's basically a song of distress, of grief, of pain. So roughly 1 in 3 Psalms in the book of Psalms is a song that is a reflection of pain that is directed as a prayer towards God. I want to read to you one of those Psalms. And what you'll notice about the lament Psalms as you go through Psalms is that they usually have this turn, like a third of the way through or a halfway through, where they turn towards hope. They turn towards trust. They turn towards faith in God and the goodness of God. And so I want to read a lament psalm to you, Psalm 88. And it's a bit long, and I'm not always the greatest reader, but I want to read the whole thing to you so you can kind of see the structure of the whole thing. This is Psalm 88. O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out day and night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. That's a metaphor that means death or the pit. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I'm a man who has no strength, like one set loose among the dead. Like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they have been cut off from your hand. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me. You overwhelm me with all your waves. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a horror to them. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. My eyes grow dim through sorrow. Every day I called upon you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the departed rise up and praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in Abaddon? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? But I, O Lord, cry out to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? Afflicted and close to death from youth up, I suffer your terrors. I am helpless. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dreadful assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. They close in on me together. You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness. Did you see the turn? I didn't see it either. And I read the whole psalm. That was the whole thing. You can check. It was just, there was no turn. I think this is the only psalm in the Bible where there is no turn. It's just 18 verses of pain and anguish and difficulty and crying out to God, and then it ends. This psalm has long kind of puzzled Bible scholars. But they all agree on one thing, that the psalmist is in no way trying to pretend that what he's going through doesn't hurt. He's in no way trying to pretend that he's not disillusioned, that he's not in pain, that he's not in anguish, that he's not in grief, that he's not deeply confused and searching for God and not finding him. He's not pretending it doesn't hurt. And when you go to God, you don't have to either. When God says no, you can turn to wonder, you can look to further redemption, but you also don't have to pretend that it doesn't hurt. I recently received some bad news, and I'm okay. You don't have to be like, are you okay after service? But just being honest with you guys, like when I received that news, one of my first prayers about it as a reflex was, God, how could you do this? How could you let this happen? Like, why? For what reason? I believe deep in my soul that God received that prayer. And in that situation, I can already see seeds of redemption being sown. But you know what? I've still gone back to God and say, I see that, but I think you could have done that a different way. You're God. I know you could have done that a different way. And so I'm just so deeply confused about why you chose to do this, why you chose to allow this to happen. And I believe that God received that prayer as well. When you pray and God says no, and it's deeply just disorienting, confusing, hurtful, you know you can go right back to him and debrief the whole thing. And you can be honest about it. You can be open about it. You don't have to draft it and make it like nice and clean and pristine. Jesus isn't waiting for us to be good little Christian boys and girls who pray good little Christian prayers. We can pray the ugly ones. We can pray the angry ones. We can pray the hurt ones. We can pray the disillusioned ones. He receives those prayers as well. When we're seeking him and not finding him, and we're searching for his presence and we're feeling only his absence, we don't have to pretend like we're okay with that. We don't have to pretend that that doesn't hurt. And we can be open and honest and candid about that with God. He can take it. He invites it. That might make some of you feel a little uncomfortable. Like, this is like, remember we're reading the Job thing? Like, he created the universe, separated the sky from the land and the sea from everything else. Like, he's holy, he's sovereign, he is the infinite creator God. Like, we do have to have some level of like reverence and decorum, right? And yes, we never want to lose sight of the grandness of God. That's why we're invited to turn to wonder. But let me tell you a couple things. First one is this. God already knows what's in your heart. So, I don't know. You might as well just let it rip and ask him for forgiveness. I don't know if that's the best advice, but he already knows, okay? So you can confess, like, this is how I feel, God. And I think the other thing is this. There's a huge difference between lashing out at someone out of spite and having a really frank, honest, sometimes emotional conversation with someone who you care about. And one thing I'm learning as a father is that a sign that your home is an emotionally safe environment is that your children actually talk back to you and argue with you. In which case, my children must live in the most emotionally safe environment in America, maybe the world. But God the Father is so much safer a father than I could ever hope to be. So when you're confused and disillusioned, you can turn to wonder, you can look for the redemption, but you can also just talk to God and say, this hurts, and I don't know why or if there even is a why. I would love a response from you. And when I'm not getting it, that hurts even worse. When you pray and God says no, you don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt. The next time we meet together, it'll be Easter. And as we look to the end of the Lent season, I'm reminded of the fact that the days leading up to Jesus' resurrection were the darkest days of his whole life. On the night that Jesus was to be betrayed, he sat in a garden praying in anguish by himself because his friends couldn't even stay awake to pray with him. And so by himself, alone in pain, he prayed, God, if there is any other way for you to accomplish this mission in me, apart from what is about to happen, please let this cup pass from me. If there's literally any other way that you could do this, I am asking you, please let it be a different way than this. For hours and hours, Jesus prayed this prayer in pain and in anguish before God alone. And God said no. And so if you have ever prayed and felt hurt and confused that God said no to something that it seemed like a no-brainer that he would say yes to, and you've lived in the disillusionment and the pain of that, I want you to know that Jesus Christ himself knows exactly how you feel. And if God the Father can do that to his own beloved Son and turn it into the salvation of humanity itself, then you can know that his apparent absence, his apparent lack of action in your life when he says no, is not an indication of any lack of love for you. It might just be time for you to get in the ring and start wrestling with God. So if that is you this morning, if you are hurt and confused and doubting and uncertain, this is my charge to you. Become like our spiritual ancestor Jacob and do not let go of God until he blesses you. Don't let go. Through the pain, do not let go. Through the confusion, don't let go. Through the anger, don't let go. Though you might be tired, though you might be weary, though you might feel injured, say, God, even if I limp for the rest of my life after this, I will not let go until you bless me. Settle in your heart and in your mind that you will strive and wrestle and not let go until God blesses you. And even still, I'll tell you this. There may come a time when your grip begins to loosen and your strength begins to fail. And you might very well let go. Some of you might be close in this moment right now. Some of you might have already done it. And if that's you, I want you to know something even more important. That Jesus has not let go of you. He hasn't let go of you. You know, Jesus never promised that there wouldn't be pain. In fact, he promised the opposite. But what he did also promise was that he would never leave you or forsake you. And he has not, and he will not. He is closer to you in your pain than you can even know. That's what we celebrate this season, that he has entered into our pain so that we can enter into his paradise. So when it's all said and done, may the same be said of us as was said of Jacob, that we have striven with God and humanity and prevailed. But for now, just don't let go.